You know how sometimes a single phrase just clicks? It seems to explain everything. An idea so powerful it can actually shape the foreign policy of a superpower? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about today, as we dive into the life and work of the incredibly influential and intensely controversial historian Bernard Lewis.
Clash of civilizations. You've definitely heard it. It's one of those phrases that just took over the conversation and sparked a debate that's been raging for decades. So was it a prophecy, a warning about some inevitable conflict between Islam and the West? Or was it a problematic idea that maybe helped create the very conflict it was describing? To even start to unpack that, you got to go back to the source.
And that source, the guy who really laid the intellectual groundwork for an idea that would echo all the way to the White House, well, that was Bernard Lewis. This is his story, the story of the scholar who, for better or for worse, became the West's leading interpreter of the Middle East.
Okay, so before we jump into all the drama and controversy, and trust me, there's a lot of it, we really need to get why people listened to him in the first place. What gave him so much authority? Well, first and foremost, Bernard Lewis was an absolute titan of a scholar. For a huge chunk of the 20th century, when it came to the history of Islam, he was pretty much unmatched.
And I mean, we're not just talking about some guy in an ivory tower. He was a genuine intellectual force. His life's work, it's basically a whole library in itself. Think about it, a career that lasted almost 100 years, covering a history of 1,400 years. It's just mind-boggling.
Get this, 32 books. Not pamphlets, books. And that's on top of hundreds and hundreds of articles. I mean, that sheer volume of work alone is enough to see why he was considered one of the top experts on the planet.
But it wasn't just about quantity. His credentials, honestly, they're just staggering. This guy wasn't just reading other people's books. He mastered something like a dozen languages, so he could read the original sources himself. He was one of the very first Western scholars to get his hands on the Ottoman archives when they were finally opened. He taught at the most prestigious universities, SOAS in London, then Princeton. Oh, and on the side, during World War II, he worked for British intelligence, MI6. Yeah, so when you put all that together, the languages, the original research, the real-world intelligence background, you can see why his words carried so much weight.
So you've got this incredible authority, this deep well of knowledge, and he focuses all of it on one huge provocative question: what went wrong? He looked at the Islamic world, which was once this dominant global force, and asked why it had fallen so far behind the West. And his answer, yeah, it was controversial right from the get-go.
This quote from his huge bestseller, What Went Wrong, really sums up his whole argument. He says that when things go wrong in the Middle East, the question isn't what did we do wrong, but who did this to us? He's pointing to what he saw as a culture of blame, always looking for an outside enemy, the West, colonialism, you name it, instead of looking inward.
And this is really the core of his thesis. Lewis's big claim was that the struggles of the modern Middle East were not, as many people argued, primarily the fault of Western colonialism. Nope. He said the root causes were internal. He talked about things like cultural arrogance and a resistance to modernizing, things he believed were deeply embedded in the region's own culture and religion. This was a massive challenge to the whole post-colonial narrative.
Now, you might think an argument like that would just stay in dusty academic journals, right? Wrong. This idea made a huge leap right from the university campus into the halls of power in Washington, D.C., and there it found some very, very eager listeners.
And those listeners were the neoconservatives. You know, the movement famously defined by its founder, Irvin Kristol, as a liberal who has been mugged by reality. What that meant for foreign policy was a much more assertive, interventionist America. And for them, Bernard Lewis's ideas were like a godsend. They provided the perfect historical and intellectual justification for that kind of muscular foreign policy.
And we're not talking about a subtle influence here. The connection was direct and powerful. After 9/11, Lewis was on speed dial for the Bush administration. He was in the room advising Vice President Dick Cheney and Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. His whole argument that the problem was internal to the Arab world and maybe a big shock could kickstart change, that became a key part of the intellectual case for invading Iraq in 2003.
I mean, you can literally see it in the titles of his books at the time. In Germany, one was called The Rage of the Arab World, another one asked Clash of Cultures. These were punchy, powerful ideas that perfectly matched the moment for policymakers trying to make sense of a post-9/11 world.
And he wasn't just whispering in their ears behind the scenes. Lewis went public. He wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal in 2002 called Time for Toppling. And in it, he made his case, arguing that, yeah, regime change is risky, but sometimes the dangers of inaction are greater than those of action. Coming from a scholar of his stature, that gave a huge intellectual cover for the push to war.
Okay, but an influence that powerful is bound to get some pushback, right? And it absolutely did. In fact, Lewis's ideas sparked a firestorm of opposition. So much so that today, you can't talk about his scholarship without also talking about the intense controversy that surrounds him.
And his #1 intellectual opponent, his great rival, was the literary scholar Edward Said. Said's book Orientalism was a bombshell. He basically argued that the entire Western way of studying the East wasn't objective scholarship at all. He said it was a tool of empire, designed to create this distorted, demeaning view of Arabs. Lewis, of course, completely rejected this. He defended his field as a legitimate pursuit. For Lewis, it was simple. Learn the languages, study the archives, and you can understand a culture. But for Said, a Westerner could never truly be objective. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was a battle over the very meaning of knowledge itself.
You know, Lewis had this incredibly sharp wit, and he had a fantastic comeback for anyone who said his identity disqualified him from studying the Middle East. A reporter asked him about it once, and he just shot back, "Oceanography professors are not required to be fish." It's a brilliant line, and it perfectly captures his whole philosophy, that objective scholarship is possible no matter who you are.
But there was another controversy, one that was maybe even more damaging to his reputation. And it had to do with his shifting views on the Armenian genocide. See, back in 1961, in the first edition of his book on Turkey, he called it a terrible Holocaust, but then in later editions he softened the language to a terrible slaughter, and he started arguing that it wasn't a one-sided genocide, but more of a mutual struggle between two competing nationalist groups. This was a huge shift, and it landed him in a French court in 1995, which formally censured him, saying his remarks had caused real harm.
And it's really important to be clear here. Lewis's view on this is not the mainstream one, not at all. The vast majority of historians reject it, and it's led to these persistent accusations of genocide denial. It really became a major stain on his academic legacy.
And yet, through all of this, Lewis himself almost seemed to enjoy the fight. He loved intellectual combat. One of his favorite sayings, which he attributed to Muslims during one of their golden ages, was, "Disagreement is a grace of our community." For him, arguing, debating, that wasn't a problem. That was a sign that ideas were alive and well.
So where does that leave us? We're left with this really tough question. Was Bernard Lewis a brilliant, dispassionate historian who was just brave enough to speak uncomfortable truths, or was he an ideologue whose scholarship became the intellectual ammunition for a very specific political agenda? His ideas had massive, real-world consequences, and his story makes you wonder, where do you draw the line between just explaining the world and actively trying to change it?